Thank you, colleagues. What a great day for the American Academy of Religion, isn't it? For the last several days, we've been having an ongoing teach-in, as it were, on the problem of climate change and our responsibilities as religious scholars. And this may be our culminating panel to really bring us to the kind of attention on this issue that no one but President Jimmy Carter can possibly do. We're extraordinarily grateful, extraordinarily happy, and quite honored by his presence, and I know all of you are as well. We have 3 panelists today, so I'm going to introduce them in order. The first is Stephen Kepnes, who is professor of world religions and Jewish studies and director of Chapel House, an interfaith retreat center at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. He is the author of 7 books, including The Future of Jewish Theology. He has written in the areas of religion, politics, and the environment, and is a founding member of one of my organizations, the Society for Scriptural Reasoning. He is a wonderful speaker and thinker. He has doing group readings of the New Testament text, Torah, and the Quran all around the world, including in Jerusalem and in the Vatican. So it's a real honor to welcome him, Jewish theologian. Mary Evelyn Tucker. Mary Evelyn Tucker is a senior lecturer and research scholar at Yale University, where she has appointments in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, as well as the Divinity School and the Department of Religious Studies. She teaches in the joint MA program in Religion and Ecology and directs the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale with her husband, John Grimm. Her concern for the growing environmental crisis, especially in Asia, the subject of her research, led her to organize a series of 10 conferences on world religions and ecology at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. And she is series co-editor for the 10 volumes that emerged from those wonderful conferences. After the conference series, she and Grimm founded the Forum on Religion and Ecology at a culminating conference at the United Nations in 1998, long before many of us were thinking about this issue. She has served on the International Earth Charter drafting committee from 1997 to 2000 and was a member of the Earth Charter International Council and, of course, of our AAR section on religion and ecology. I consider her one of the founders of the field of religion and ecology, not only at the AAR but nationally, and I thank her for her presence today. And Jimmy Carter, who sort of needs no introduction. But I'll do it anyway, right? Jimmy Carter served as the 39th President of the United States from 1977 to 1981. During Carter's term as president, he created 2 new cabinet-level departments, the Department of Energy and the Department of Education. He established a national energy policy. Yes, that does deserve applause. He established a national energy policy that included conservation, price control, and new technology. In foreign affairs, he pursued the Camp David Accords, the Panama Canal Treaties, and the second round of SALT talks, SALT II, and then he returned the Panama Canal Zone to Panama and deepened diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. In 1982, President Carter became University Distinguished Professor at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and he founded the Carter Center, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that actively addresses international and national issues of public policy and advances human rights. Carter is a key figure in the Habitat for Humanity project, building homes himself. He is the author of 28 books, including a brand new one this year on women and religion. In 2002, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I might add the second Nobel Prize winner to speak to us just this weekend at the AAR. I invited President Carter to speak to us at the AAR for all of these reasons. I hold him personally responsible for an enduring and precious peace between Israel and Egypt, a peace that has stood, thank God, for decades. I invited him because when he was governor, he placed portraits of Martin Luther King Jr. and 2 other prominent black Georgians in the Capitol building, even as the Ku Klux Klan picketed the unveiling ceremony. I invited him because Carter pushed reforms through the legislature to provide equal state aid to schools in both the wealthy and poor areas of Georgia. He set up community centers for mentally handicapped children, and he increased educational programs for convicts. On April 18, 1977, Carter delivered a televised speech declaring that the U.S. energy crisis during the 1970s was the moral equivalent of war. He encouraged energy conservation by all U.S. citizens, and he installed, this is why he's here, solar water heating panels on the White House. He wore sweaters, lovely blue ones, to offset turning down the heat in the White House, and he was the first person in public life to take this problem seriously and make a personal and then public stand. As a bioethicist who works in Africa, I am grateful that the Carter Center brokered a deal for Merck to give cheap drugs that eliminated 99.7% of cases of guinea worm disease, meaning that 3.5 million people are free of this horrible scourge. I do not agree with every one of his ideas, of course, but his leadership is the most important moral issue of our time, climate change, has been steady and has been courageous. Just lately, here's what he wrote about it. And this is President Carter. With the latest warnings delivered by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change over the past few weeks, no world leader will ever be able to claim that they were caught off guard by climate change. As a former head of state, I have experienced global crises from within the corridors of power. Some may take the world by surprise, but sometimes the warning signals are such that there is no excuse not to act. The IPCC report is such a signal. The report of Working Group 2 of the IPCC is the most sobering assessment to date of the risk posed to humanity by climate change, describing a range of threats in a clear yet measured tone. Around the world, people's crops and homes are in danger already. This will only get worse if nothing is done. Economic shocks and worsening poverty, exacerbated by a warming planet, will also increase the risk of armed conflict. It is the world's poorest who are the most vulnerable. The report does not dictate exact scenarios, but tells us with unprecedented authority what we must be ready for. For this reason, it is a compelling call to action for governments. It can trigger decisive action, notably on greenhouse gases, emission reduction, and financing for climate adaptation. On the road to December 2015, when world leaders will meet at a major conference in Paris, perhaps our last chance to agree to a new climate deal. This is the leadership we so desperately need. And finally, I invited him because he teaches Sunday school, and he is a deacon at the Marantha Baptist Church in his hometown of Plains. And so we welcome another teacher of religion to the American Academy of Religion.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, that was a beautiful introduction, and I'm very grateful to Laurie for it. She's been very helpful at the Carter Center in preparing for our own work from now until the end of my days on earth to make sure that women have an equal chance in the world alongside men. One of the things that I appreciate is having a chance to be free to move around, to meet with whom I choose, to go where I wish, and to say what I really believe. And that has come about since I left office. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite cartoons in a New Yorker magazine came out a few years ago. This little boy is looking up at his father. He says, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." So you see, I learned about that pretty well personally when I made my first trip after I left the White House. I went to China as a guest of Deng Xiaoping, with whom I had normalized diplomatic relations. And on the way back, we stopped in Japan. And I was asked to make a speech at a very small college down near Osaka. very small Christian college, as a matter of fact. And when I got there, I saw that the whole audience was very tense. The professors were upset, and the parents were nervous, and the children were nervous as well. And I thought that I would just kind of put them at ease, and I thought maybe I'd just tell them a joke. I knew it took a long time to say anything in Japanese, so I didn't choose my funniest joke, I just chose my shortest joke. And when I got through telling my joke, it was the best response I ever had to a joke in my life. And I couldn't wait for my speech to get over, and I went back into the green room and I asked the interpreter, "How did you tell my joke?" And he was very evasive. He kept avoiding the question, and finally I said, "Look, you've got to tell me, how did you tell my joke? It went over so well." He said, "I told the audience, President Carter told a funny story, everybody must laugh." So you see there's some real advantages in being a former president, and that's one of them. Well, anyway, I'm delighted to be here with this great assembly, and I'm very grateful to be here with other people who teach religion. I teach in a very small way. I teach in Maranatha Baptist Church. We have about 25 of our regular members, but on an average Sunday we have about 200 or 300 visitors who come to hear a politician teach the Holy Word. So I guess that they stop on the way to Florida and so forth. So I have a very large crowd every Sunday. So that's what I have as a background on this. But I have gotten acquainted in recent years in traveling around with Rosalind about the plight of women and girls in the entire world. We have programs now at the Carter Center in 80 different countries, in Latin America and Asia, and also particularly in Africa. 35 of them are in Africa. And Rosa and I have visited more than 145 countries, really since I left the White House. And the main lesson I've learned from that concerns me most deeply is what is happening to women and girls around the world. This is shocking facts that we have learned. Many of you, if you're not familiar with it, if you haven't read the latest book written about it, which is mine, you will be surprised at how extensive it is. And one of the main reasons of this abuse of women and girls is a misinterpretation of Holy Scriptures, where dominant men in religious organizations have basically ordained, I think contrary to the Holy Scriptures, that women are inferior to men in the eyes of God. This is an element of self-delusion. And even though people may not agree with that premise, men quite often, if they're in a position of power or authority, they don't want to endanger their own privileged position. So they stay mute or go along with the misinterpretation of Scriptures. I grew up this way. I grew up in a small community near Plains, Georgia, called Archery. Ours was the only white family who lived there. All of my neighbors were African American. All of my playmates were black kids. We worked in the fields together, we fished on the streams together, we fought with each other, we wrestled with each other, we respected each other. And I didn't really realize at that time that my black neighbors were not permitted to vote. They were not permitted to serve on a jury. They had the inferior jobs. Their schools were despicable. And even the white people, my neighbors, who wanted to treat African Americans equally, took advantage of these times. It went on for 100 years. From the time of the war between the states, the Civil War, in 1865, until 1964 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. And we just looked the other way. The most profoundly respected religious scholars would come into our church to prove to us that if you read the right verses in the Bible, there are about 33,000 in the Holy Bible, then it proved that blacks were not equal in the eyes of God to white people. And we have the same misinterpretation now concerning the relationship between men and women. The Carter Center has been deeply involved in Egypt. I negotiated a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, and since then we've been there quite regularly. 91% of all the females in Egypt have had their genitals mutilated. This is just one of the problems in those areas of the world. In Djibouti and in Somalia, 97% of all the women now living, all the females now living, have had their genitals mutilated. And sometimes the operation is a horrible affliction on the women and girls. They begin when they're about 3 or 4 years old. Honor killings still take place in many parts of the world, not just in Islamic communities, but in others as well, where if a girl is raped by a stranger, she's condemned by her parents as a disgrace to the family, and she is quite often murdered. About 75% by her father, about 25% by her mother or her uncles. These things go on now. There was just a horrible case in Lahore, Pakistan, not too long ago, when a young woman married a man with whom that had not been approved by her parents, and she was killed with brickbats and rocks on the way into the main legislative authority building in Lahore, Pakistan. These things go on all over the world. The most horrible statistic that I can give you is that at this moment there are 160 million females missing from the face of the earth. That's about 4 times as many as were killed in the Second World War, when 40 million people died. 160 million little girls have died because they were strangled by their parents at birth, or now with the advent of sonograms, they are aborted as a fetus if it can be determined that they're going to be female when they're born. In China today, for every 100 girls, there are 118 boys. In India, for every 100 girls, there are 112 boys. And the other little girls were killed by their parents. These are the kind of statistics that are almost incredible, but should be on the consciousness of everyone in this audience and everyone in the world. How do we correct these problems? It's not just in foreign countries. It also includes our own nation as well. There are more people today sold as slaves across international borders than there ever were in the 18th and 19th centuries, when black people were taken out of Africa and sold in the New World as slaves. And about 80% of the people sold across international borders now into slavery are girls, sold into sexual bondage. The Carter Center is in Atlanta, Georgia. And at our last conference in Atlanta on this subject, last June, it was reported that there are between 200 and 300 people sold into slavery in Atlanta every month. And about 80% of them are girls. The reason that Atlanta is the #1 trading post for slavery today is because we have the busiest airport on earth. And a lot of our passengers come from the southern hemisphere, where the people's skin is brown or black. And a brothel owner in and around Atlanta can buy a dark-skinned girl for about $1,000. The U.S. State Department is required by the Congress to report on human trafficking or slavery these days. And they report that 60,000 people live in the United States now in bondage. These things are embarrassing to talk about, and they're grievous as an affliction on the integrity and the moral values of the human race. You may have read recently about the problem on college campuses in our country. That's one of the most respected institutions in America, is our great university system. On college campuses, sexual assault is rarely mentioned, reported, or punished. In the average community in America where you live, about 35% of all the rapes of a girl are reported to the police. On college campuses, less than 5%. Because girls are discouraged from reporting sexual assault even on our greatest universities. Last week I spoke at Harvard. Harvard is one of those universities. For the last 33 years I have taught at Emory University in Atlanta. Emory is also on one of those lists. The Department of Justice reported last week, and according to the New York Times, that 90% of the rapes on college campuses are perpetrated by 4% of the boys. Because when they get to college, they realize they can do this with impunity. We have another problem in the other respected institution in our country, and that's the military. Earlier this year, the Department of Defense reported that in 2012, the last year for which they have statistics, 26,000 cases of sexual assault. And the number of people punished, 310. About 1%. We know that for full-time employees in America, women get 23% less pay per year. Of the Fortune 500 corporations, 23 have women chief executive officers, and they are paid less on average than the men. I belong to a group called the Elders. There are just 10 members. Nelson Mandela was the first member. His wife is still a member. Archbishop Tutu is another one. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, is another one. Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, is another. The former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Brundtland, who later became the leader of the World Health Organization, is another member. Also the former presidents of Mexico and Colorado, and Brazil are members of this elders. Last week at the Carter Center, we had a session there. The elders met, and we had an evening forum to describe the exclusion of women as peacekeepers, peacemakers. The United Nations Security Council passed a binding resolution a few years ago called number 1325. It requires that when two antagonistic groups are negotiating a peace agreement, that women have to be deeply involved, ostensibly equally involved. There was an analysis made in preparation for our meeting of 31 recently concluded peace agreements. There were 40 times as many men at the negotiating table as there were women. 40 times as many. And it turns out that of those peace agreements that lasted, women were involved in most of those. The reason is that women and men bring a different attitude toward peace. I've been involved in many negotiations for peace. And quite often, the debate is about groups of people, or armies, or nations, or political parties contending with each other. That's what men would ordinarily do. But when a woman goes to the negotiating table, she's talking about my children, my home, my husband, my immediate community, and how will this agreement affect us and let us live in peace. So there's quite a difference, but women are still excluded from this process. If you read the New York Times this morning, there's a major article in there about the negotiation now with the Taliban. in Afghanistan. When the Taliban were in power, they forbade legally a woman having a job, a girl going to school, or a woman leaving her house without being accompanied by her husband or a designated man. And they still insist that at the negotiating table, women be excluded. That's going on today. It's in the New York Times this morning, as I said. You see, these are the problems that we face. We're going to be discussing in a few minutes climate change. Climate change came to the awareness of leaders when I happened to be president. In 1979, scientists from Woods Hole in Massachusetts came down to the Capitol, to the White House, and talked to my science advisor, Dr. Frank Press. And they said, something's happening with long-term trend in global warming about which we have never known before. They didn't know for sure at that time that this global warming was caused by the excessive use of burning of carbon products and the release of the oil gases into the air. Now they know. Every responsible scientist in America, every responsible scientist in the nation, in the world knows that global warming is real and something needs to be done about it. But there are some politicians that are self-deluded deliberately to accommodate the oil industry and the purveyors of carbon products that don't want it to be known. This has a very great impact in the future on the subject of my recent book, because there's no doubt that when people begin to scramble for increasingly scarce food, the girls will be last. Whenever there comes a time of having decreased sizes of families, the boy babies will be cherished. The girls will be executed at birth, or the family will apologize for having a girl. So climate change is going to exacerbate the relative plight of girls and women in the future, unless strong and able and educated and influential people do something about it. My hope is that thousands of people here, 10,000 maybe, will take upon yourselves as a compliant policy in the religion that you cherish, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, a responsibility to say, this is something for which I will use my utmost influence. Not to distort the Scripture, but to emphasize the fact that all of us human beings have been created by God equally, and we are loved by God equally. Thank you.
President Carter, it's such an honor to have you here, to hear you speak with your clear, strong voice, to have someone of your stature address political and moral issues with the clarity that you still bring to them. I think all of us, unfortunately, or many of us in America, miss that kind of strong moral voice and leadership that you have, that you brought as president and then afterwards, even though maybe everyone in this room doesn't agree with all your policies. I think we all respect you immensely. And respectfully, You mentioned in your discussion of religion in women that that a true reading or a basic reading of Scripture, the real meaning of Scripture, is equality between all human beings. But certainly you know as a Bible teacher that there are elements in the Scriptures that that in some ways legitimate male power over female. In the beginnings of the Bible, that Eve comes from the rib, and she is to listen to the voice of her husband. There are many, you know this. So I guess I'd first want to hear you reflect upon the real sense that in the religions there are legitimations of male power over female. And then maybe speak of some of the resources perhaps that you talk about in Sunday school, because resources in the Bible and the Scriptures to address women as more as equals.
Well, obviously, I get these questions in my Sunday school class as well, and but not quite as contentious as your question has been, which I don't mind. But I've read obviously and taught the book of Genesis, and in Genesis 1 it says that God created man and women in His own eyes, in His own way. And then in the second chapter, it says that He created women from a rib of Adam, who needed a partner. Well, I understand that. And I also know that in the New Testament, when Paul writes to the Galatians, he says that there's no difference between a Jew and a Gentile. There's no difference between a man and a woman. There's no difference between a slave and a master. All are created and loved in the same way by God. So you can pick out the particular verses. There are about, as I mentioned, I think there are 33,000 verses in the Bible. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to believe that white people are superior to blacks, you can also find some verses in the Bible that condone the continuation of slavery and so forth. But I don't believe in slavery, and I don't believe that men are created superior to women in the eyes of God.
Thank you.
President Carter, just to follow up, clearly there's a lot of people, even in this audience, who've been working on issues of feminism and issues of reinterpreting the Bible, and we could name a lot of them. At Yale Divinity School, Margaret Farley and others have worked on that, Elizabeth Fiorenza. In Canada, Heather Eaton and Yvonne Jabara in Latin America, and Professor Chung in Asia. So I'm just giving this shout out to women who have been working on these issues for some time. And I think the question is how we bring them forward even further. So if you want to comment on how can we take the rich resources that have been produced in academia and bring them out, maybe even through the Carter Center, who knows?
Well, the Carter Center will be devoted to this subject for the rest of my lifetime.
Yeah.
I'm 90 years old now. I don't know how many years it'll be, but I hope it'll be a few more. But that will be a number one priority of ours. And I want to refer to Stephen's point. I'm not trying to change anybody's mind. But if you agree with me that women should be treated equally in the eyes of men and God and all, then I hope you'll join in. If you believe that men are superior to women, go ahead and persecute women. I hope you don't do it. But anyway, I feel in a very inferior way here because I'm talking to biblical scholars and people who devote your lives to studying about the interpretations of the Holy Scriptures, and I'm not in that category. No, I'm more of a peanut farmer who teaches the Bible every Sunday.
And I'm just working on a joint agreement between AAR and the Carter Center.
You've got that already, yes.
There's a lot of, I think, people who would help on this issue. But maybe just to follow up with academia, because you've highlighted it in your book, which is wonderful. And the sense that this is appearing in the news all over and so on. And even we know academic women aren't treated all that well. But this climate of violence against women that is, as you said, with impunity on our campuses. You're going to Yale this next week. You've been to Harvard. What can we do from your view, to address this even further?
Well, I'm sure you know that the majority of students now in our universities are women.
Yeah.
But in my book, I point out specifically how many of them are tenured, how many of them are professors, how many of them are presidents of colleges, and so forth, and that is still a great disparity.
Yes.
And I think that when men see the biblical leaders, the Islamic leaders, the Jewish leaders, the Christian leaders, saying that women are excluded from full and equal service of God, it gives a potential husband who wants to beat his wife, or an employer who wants to pay a woman less, an excuse. If women are not equal in the eyes of God, why should I treat them equally? And I think this is what we need to address, and I would trust the scholars to help me. In my third chapter of the book, I kind of stretched myself by writing about the specific verses in the Bible. And I remember, I happen to be a Christian, and I know when Paul wrote to the Romans, I think in the 16th chapter, and listed about 25 people who had been key leaders in the early church, as bishops, as prophets, as pastors, and so forth. About half of them are women. But something happened about the 3rd or 4th century of the Christian church, and then men began to say, well, women can't be performing these points of view. And then I was a Southern Baptist Convention member for the first 70 years of my life. I was very active in the Southern Baptist Convention. In the year 2000, the Southern Baptists convened a meeting in Orlando, Florida, and the leaders, all of whom were men, ordained that a woman could no longer be a pastor, or a deacon, or a chaplain. And they also ordained that in some of the Baptist seminaries where future pastors are taught, that a woman professor cannot teach a class if there's a boy among the students. Well, so my wife and I decided to leave the Southern Baptist Convention. And but without any arrogance or animosity, and we're still a Baptist in our little church, but in our small church in Plains, my wife has been a deacon, and we have had women pastors and so forth. So I believe that in the eyes of God, they ought to be treated. But as far as this biblical proof, as I said, I kind of stretched my knowledge of the scriptures in my book.
It's great.
This is a long-standing problem, the violence against women. Can you give us any of your thoughts, insights into why it is that people, our government, United Nations, the nations of the world, even while knowing about violence against women, don't seem to do anything about it? In some ways, they don't really seem to care because they don't act.
Well, when the United Nations does something, quite often it doesn't have a permanent effect, except on a few people. For instance, the United Nations General Assembly has passed 2 resolutions in the last few years outlawing genital cutting or mutilation. But people ignore that subject. And as I said, under United Nations Security Council, Resolution 1325, they ordained that women have to play a prominent role in the negotiation for peace. In this last United Nations session, they passed a Security Council resolution that makes permanent the criminality of rape in war zones. That has not been the case in the past. And they have ordained that in the future, that people who are guilty of rape in war zones of women will never be granted immunity. They'll always be subject to trial and persecution by the International Criminal Court. And that was done by a famous woman, Angelina Jolie, and also the former Foreign Minister of Great Britain. So I think we are making progress in the direction of the United Nations emphasizing women. But it's progress after retrogression, because the only time in human history when I would say the whole world came together to establish in a secular way biblical ideals, moral values, and ethical values was right after the Second World War, when the United Nations was formed with a concept which people believed in: no more wars. if there would be an altercation break out, then the United Nations would take care of it and negotiate a peace agreement or send in troops belonging to the United Nations. And a few years after that, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed. 30 very brief verses, and they invariably emphasize the total equality in every aspect of life of women and men. Mm-hmm. But I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times last year and pointed out that at this moment, the United States violates 10 of those 30 paragraphs. So in the highest element of ideals of human beings, we've always gone back to the point that women and men are equal in secular law and also in biblical or scriptural law.
Maybe just to pick up on that and then to move towards climate change. And you have 23 recommendations in this book at the end, and one of them, which we really appreciate, is that you're saying men need to step up for this sense of the equality of women. And that's in the academy and outside the academy. So I'd love to draw you out on that. How can men help in this issue?
Well, I know one man is trying.
Exactly. That's why we're so delighted.
Well, you know, I think men...
Plenty of men here.
2 men, okay. Very.
My husband.
But one of the other things that I mentioned, well, the 23 recommendations, I wouldn't want to put any one of them above the other, but the first recommendation, I think, is for prominent women to speak out. When I was president, we tried to get the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution passed. We couldn't do it because Phyllis Schlafly and other women came forward and they opposed it and they killed it. So women and men who are in prominent positions need to make sure that they try to bring about this change. But I think increasingly people are getting aware of it. And since the book came out, there have been, I'd say, maybe 5 times as many articles in the newspapers about these kinds of violations as there ever were before. Yes. And I noticed that Rolling Stone, if you'll pardon my mentioning that in this assembly, Rolling Stone came out with an article last week concerning rape on the college campus of University of Virginia, where a young girl, 18 years old, was taken into one of the fraternities and gang raped by 7 boys with 2 watching over it. And that happened more than a year ago, and the officials of University of Virginia didn't do anything about it except tell the girl to be quiet until the Rolling Stone article came out. So I think there's a growing awareness now of what is going on and a way to correct one by one these problems. As a matter of fact, there are fewer women, little girls in Egypt now being circumcised than there were before. Of the little girls under 17 years old, only 74% of them have been genitally mutilated, whereas above that, it's above 95%. So there's some changes that are taking place.
And we are immensely grateful for the attention you're drawing to these issues. Now we'll move.
And I hope we'll have 10,000 more people drawing attention to the issues in the future.
Indeed.
Yeah, so we'd like to have you address more specifically some of the issues of climate change, that really the theme that our president, Laurie Zoloth, has put on our agenda. I want to take you back a little historically to your administration. I remember in 1977, in April, I was a young divinity school student at the University of Chicago. You were a young president, but I was younger. I was taking a seminar on William...
Almost everybody's younger.
So I was taking a seminar with David Tracy on William James, and you had your speech then. You had, that we had to make solving the energy crisis the moral equivalent of war. Quotation from William James. So first I want to ask you, why did you use that expression? And secondly, perhaps more importantly, how did you come to make energy one of the centerpieces of your presidency?
Well, I saw then, primarily with advice from Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was my boss when I was in the submarine force. I helped build a second atomic submarine in Schenectady, New York. And when I got ready to make that speech, Hyman Rickover said, why don't you use the expression moral equivalent of war?
I see.
But I saw then that the impending shortage of energy was a very severe affliction on our country because it made us depend on foreign nations to help shape our foreign policy, and that's just recently been changed. Also, I saw that there was a horrible deterioration in the quality of our air and water because of the excessive use of carbon products. And I tried to make them renewable, both for clearer air and also others. So we started emphasizing then solar panels, which were just in the embryonic stage of development, and also windmills, and also the use of other products that wouldn't contaminate the air. And we passed laws eventually before I went out of office to make sure that big utensils and kitchens like stoves and refrigerators were efficient. And that all homes built after that time had to be well insulated. And that automobiles had to be more and more efficient in miles per gallon. So we passed all those laws at that time. And primarily it was to make sure that we were free of unwarranted influence or persuasion from oil suppliers on whom we became overly dependent.
So you already saw then environmental degradation. It wasn't only an economic and even military strategic issue for you. Already you could see that it was a climate issue, although I imagine you didn't know about global warming at that time, or did you?
No, except that I mentioned in my talk, I believe, that the scientists at Woods Hole came to the White House while I was still president and talked to my science advisor and said that they had detected that there was a long-term trend upward in global temperatures. And they didn't know then exactly what caused it, but they knew it was probably because of carbon dioxide and other carbon products developing in the atmosphere. But it was much later, I'd say 10 to 20 years later, when scientists became convinced about it was because of man-made burning of oil supplies and coal and the effluents going into the air. But so that came later after I left office.
I see.
So our former dean at Yale at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, Gus Speth, was in your administration in the Center for Environmental Quality and speaks very strongly of these issues that were bubbling up, including one of the most remarkable documents that you initiated of the Global 2000 report that Gerald Barney and others worked on, and a 3-year project. And as I understand it, one of the only times a nation has actually tried to plan forward for 20 years into the future, from 80 to 2000.
Well, we published this in 1980, and we pointed out what's going to happen between now and the year 2000 if we didn't do something about the energy crisis. And it was, I know it was the first, I think it was the only comprehensive analysis that was done about the deterioration in our environment if we didn't take firm action. Unfortunately, I won't mention any names, but with subsequent presidents, they were not as concerned as I was. But they are beginning to be concerned now. And I go to China every year, and I was there earlier this year and also last year as well. And every time I have met with Xi Jinping, the new leader of China, 4 times, 3 times before he became president. I've never met with him, but I didn't emphasize the fact that if the United States and China ever get together on what to do to correct this global warming issue, the rest of the nations will have to go along. And just recently, of course, that finally came to being after being studied for about 1.5 years by experts in China and the United States.
Yes, just to follow up on that, because it is such an important agreement, although the specifics, as you know, we're not sure yet. But can you give us a sense of why is this so important, and what do you think it will, the impacts for December 2015 in Paris?
Well, I think the scientists have basically agreed that the only way to alleviate the permanent damage, irrevocable damage, to the environment is to stop the temperature increase at 2 degrees centigrade. And so that's a goal to be reached. And one of the elders that I mentioned earlier in my talk is the former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson. And she has been designated by the United Nations as the top spokesperson for the world in this issue. And so she keeps us acquainted with it. So I don't think there's any doubt that that China, though, is suffering every day from their own self-evident inability to see each other in the street.
Yeah, yeah.
And I have been to one of the counties right around Qingdao, and I spent 2 weeks there with my wife and former senator from Georgia, Sam Nunn, and his wife. And every stream in that whole county was contaminated so badly that the farmers couldn't use the water even for irrigation, much less for fish and for drinking purposes. And the farmers were very irate. And the more the people of China condemned their own government for letting this deterioration come in their own lifestyle, I think that is what's bringing about a lot of the motivation in China to do something about it. And of course, the United States should be in the forefront. I would say that up through George H.W. Bush, about 22 years ago in Rio de Janeiro, the United States were in the forefront of fighting against climate change and global warming. Since then, we have not shown the leadership that the world is waiting for.
Thank you. We'll return to China later.
Yes, so I'm going to ask a similar question that I did before on women in the Bible, because I'm sure you're aware, we have that very famous line in Genesis 1:28, fill the earth and subdue it and rule over it. The sense that that God has given the earth to human beings to do what they will with it. And I think many scholars have pointed to that verse and others as a kind of a legitimation of human beings, Christians, Jews, others, using the earth the way they want to for their own gain. Would you recognize that our religions in some ways also can be an obstacle towards addressing issues of climate change?
Yes, there's no doubt about it. I think that any time a human being, even a biblical scholar, if they want to do something that benefits themselves, they can find some verse in the Bible that might justify their misinterpretation, of my opinion, of the Scriptures. Well, but when I was a little child, as I said, I lived on a farm, and every year in our church in Plains, Georgia, where I was baptized, they had a special week of stewardship. And they would, almost all of the members of the church were farmers. And the pastors then, no matter what their basic theology or philosophy was, would preach a special sermon that every human being is a steward of God's beautiful environment or world. And the farmers had an obligation to terrace their land and to make sure they had windbreaks and that the land didn't wash away and so forth. So my father became one of the leaders in the preservation of the quality of land, primarily because of that reminder once a year, every week, of stewardship. And I still have that kind of built into me. I still have the same land. We have been in our family since 1833, and we still take care of the land. And so I think that this is an obligation I have, not only to my family and to my descendants, but also to God. I feel like I am been entrusted by God with the possibility or obligation or duty of taking care of the beautiful land and air and water that He gave me.
Wonderful, yes.
And following through on that, yes, thank you, would be actually the motivation of many of us here for extending that profound sense of stewardship and care that you've just spoken about, to bring forward the plurality of the world's religions. Those of us in Asian studies were very concerned that as China modernized, it would want to call on its own traditions of Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, and the same for India and so on. So that was the inspiration actually for the conferences at Harvard in the mid-90s. And in fact, in China, with 1,000 protests a year on the environment, there's also this other very interesting movement of drawing on a new Confucianism Even a woman sold a book that sold 10 million copies on Confucius, and this ecological civilization that is being brought forward in China for reorienting. Can you comment on that at all?
Well, as I said, I go to China often because I normalize diplomatic relations with China, and I'm well received over there. Maybe better than in some countries I could name near here. But anyway, I don't think there's any doubt that Xi Jinping is the most powerful and authoritative leader that China has had since Deng Xiaoping, and second only to Mao Zedong. And Xi Jinping quite often refers to Confucianism. When I go to China, like I did this year, I made speeches in 4 different universities there, and also in 1 high school. And the scholars come, and quite often now they emphasize I'd say the finest aspects of Confucianism, and that self-responsibility for one people around you, and also, I think, maybe indirectly for the environment. So I think Confucianism now is looked upon by the modern day, I'd say most recent Chinese leaders, as an element of China that's being expanded greatly. There are centers for Confucianism, as you know, now being established in various countries in the world, including our own country.
Right.
I think it's a very healthy development.
Yeah. There was a conference these last 2 summers in Hunan province. A province of 93 million people would be the 12th largest economy in the world. And with the efforts of Du Weiming, a great Confucian scholar, and others, this coming forth with the governor of the province and others trying to draw on this. So it's a very exciting turn, I think, very promising.
Well, last year when I was there in Hunan province, in front of the university, there's a statue of Confucius. And that's why one reason I knew what I was talking about then. As a matter of fact, I spoke to about 6,000 Chinese students, and they had a question and answer period afterwards, and didn't require any interpretation. Everything was in English. So
Wonderful.
They're getting ahead of us in foreign languages.
Yes, that's great.
I'd like to hear you address some issues of public health, because I know the Carter Center has been very successful, for instance, in eradicating the guinea worm issue, or just about eradicating, right? So it seems that when the Carter Center takes on a task, you do it. It's obvious that climate change has brought on some unique health problems like dengue fever and West Nile virus. Is there anything that you've learned in your public health initiatives from the Carter Center, perhaps with the guinea worm issue, that could be used to address these other newer health problems brought up by climate change?
When the Carter Center first started in 1982, we thought we would just negotiate peace agreements between people. And I would go to a foreign country and negotiate. But over a period of time, the Carter Center has evolved in meeting vacuums in the world by addressing a series of health problems called by the World Health Organization neglected tropical diseases, with the accent on neglected. And we found that many of these diseases that no longer exist in the United States, not even in countries like Egypt or India, afflict hundreds of millions of people in Africa primarily. And a number of them are caused by impure water. Guinea worm is one. Guinea worm is caused by drinking water out of a stagnant pond. And in that pond, guinea worm eggs breed. They are microscopic. And if you drink the water a year later, you have a worm in your body 30 inches long. And this was probably the fiery serpent mentioned in the Old Testament when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt. And it's also the symbol for medical doctors, staff, because the only way they could treat guinea worm was to wrap it around a stick and expedite its exit out of your body. So that's one thing. We had 3.5 million cases of guinea worm in 20 different countries, and instead of 3.5 million now, this year we'll have 130. And we know where every case is. Another disease that I just came back from Mexico to celebrate is the end of river blindness. River blindness is caused by the sting of a little black fly that grows in rapidly flowing streams and stings a person, and then later they get microfilarial, microscopic worms in the body that causes blindness. We just did away with it in Mexico. I went down there to celebrate. So this is the kind of thing that we do. Another one is schistosomiasis. Schistosomiasis is caused by wading out into a river, say in Nigeria and so forth, and a snail has the worms in it, and a little worm penetrates the skin and goes inside the body, and it creates little children with distended stomachs. You've seen them with great big stomachs.
Right.
And they only grow about this tall. And it's because the microfilaria, microscopic worms in the body, eat all of the food that the child takes in through his mouth. And they
I see,
shrivel.
yeah.
Anyway, all of these are caused by impure water. And so that's just another example of what is going to happen in the future if water should become more and more impure because we don't do anything about climate change or global warming.
Could you share one strategy that you use to be successful against some of these diseases?
Yes. When we started out with guinea worm, it was all over a lot of countries. I need not go into detail about that. And I went to see a very rich man in New York City to get some money from him. I asked him for $50,000. He said, I'll give you the $50,000, but what can you do about this worm? And I said, if we had a filter cloth that wouldn't rot in the tropics, then we could strain the water through it, and then if the people strained every drink, they wouldn't get the microscopic worms in their bodies. So he said, okay, I own 20% of DuPont Company. And he said, next board meeting, I'll see if we can do something about it. So they developed a fiber that wouldn't rot in the tropics. And they made 60 million square meters of this filter cloth and gave it to the Carter Center.
I see.
And so we distributed this all over the world, and that's how we did away with the disease.
Right.
So a very rich man helped us with that.
Yeah.
I think many people are impressed by these activities because the connections that we're all making now and that you've been making for a long time of health, of food issues, of water issues, and this is the environment, right? But I want to return also to one of the most important things of many in your administration, and the ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and the descriptions you have of you and Rosalind being up there and in the Arctic. It's marvelous. And I want to draw you out because it's still an issue, and whether we will develop that or not, and what you did to try and protect it, and to say in your book, Our Endangered Values, that this will only give us a very little bit of oil compared to what we need. So I'd love you to comment on how you are thinking about this issue, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Well, when I was elected, there were a lot of, I'd say, pending jobs for me.
Yeah.
Nobody ever asked me to normalize diplomatic relations with China, but I did. Nobody asked me to negotiate between Israel and Egypt to bring peace, but I did. Nobody ever asked me to do this effort in Alaska. It had been left over since Dwight Eisenhower was president back in the 1950s when Alaska and Hawaii became states. But at the time Alaska became a state, there were millions of acres of land up there. Nobody could decide what to do about it because it was too controversial, and I decided to do it. So I worked on that for 4 years, and eventually we were able to set aside some land for the state to own, some land for the Eskimos, some for the native Indians, and some to come in for national parks and so forth. And I had opposition from the Alaskan, both senators and their congressmen, because they were in bed with the oil companies and so forth. But anyway, we found an ancient law called the Antiquities Act. And it was passed in 1907, but it gave the president a power to establish a national monument. And a national monument was ordinarily thought about as a famous old church, or maybe a battleground in the Revolutionary War. But I used it much more expansively. And, and by the time I got through doing it, we had created national monuments the same size as the state of Michigan. and so that's how I won the argument. So when we passed the National Alaska Lands Act, we doubled the total size of the National Park Service, and we tripled the size of the wilderness areas, and we set aside 25 pristine streams that would never be violated. And the amount of land that we put in the national parks and so forth was the same size as the state of California.
Incredible. Yeah.
So that's what we did. I tried to be as quick as I could.
And just to follow up, though, the issues are still pressing about onward, right?
Because we set aside a special area that was precious, that never had been disturbed at all by human beings. And we gave the oil companies the right to drill in 95% of the offshore areas of Alaska. But we set aside this little part as precious. It couldn't be changed. But the only way it can be changed is by a future president and both houses of the Congress approving it. And I never dreamed that any of my successors would ever want to do it or that the Congress would approve. But I found out that when presidents from a certain party, which I don't mention, got into power, they tried to do it. But so far we've blocked it, and it's still a very dicey thing.
What about Keystone Pipeline?
I personally am against the Keystone Pipeline.
Thank you. Can you say why?
Well, first of all, this is the most filthy way to develop oil that is known. Mm-hmm. It probably creates more air pollution in the production of the little oil that you get out of these shale deposits of any other policy in the world. And it's going to be brought down through the United States with no income from the United States, and will then be shipped out of our port in the South to different places in the world. So it's no benefit in the long term from America. There will be some employment while the pipeline is put into the ground. Yes, there'll be a few people employed along the way, but they'll confiscate a lot of land with, as you know, with a government right for eminent domain, mm-hmm. for the benefit of the oil companies in Canada, a lot of which are owned by the Koch brothers in the United States. And anyway, by the time that gets through, the permanent employment to operate this pipeline in the United States will be 33 people.
Yeah.
And so it's quite distorted, but I think there's a lot of pressure from the oil companies to make sure this does pass, and I'm afraid that after the other party takes over in the Congress next year, whose name I won't mention, it might happen.
We'll keep fighting.
I wonder if you could address us. This is the largest group of scholars of religion in the world, really. I mean, this conference, 10,000 people, not quite that many here, but what can we do in the university to address the issue of climate change? Is there things, you're a university professor as well, so you're one of us. Are there things that you would recommend for us to do to work on these issues?
Well, I think the only thing that a professor can do on any subject is to get to know the subject well first before he starts to teach it. And I presume everybody here will do that. But secondly, just ascertain as best you can what are the adverse consequences of not addressing this issue. And I make a good bit of effort to learn what's happening already. When I go to Alaska, which I do fairly often, and I go around the border of Africa along the seacoast, many of the villages have already been abandoned, primarily by the poorest people in Alaska. These are Eskimos and Indians who live in the coastal areas. And in the past, their villages have been protected. Now the water has already risen about 6 to 8 inches, which is not all that devastating. But the ice that used to protect the villages from the incoming waves is gone. And now the waves have already overcome where the village used to be, and the people have had to move. The last time I went to Alaska, the top headlines in the paper when my wife and I got off the plane was, polar bears will be gone in 25 years. When I go to Norfolk, Virginia, which is where my wife and I established our first house after we got married, there's now seawater bubbling up out of the streets in Norfolk, Virginia. And you can't even get a beautiful condominium assessed for tax purposes now off the coast of North Carolina, because they know that in the future that beach on which it's built will be gone. And we already know that also in Miami is bad. But the worst thing are in very poor countries like Philippines and Bangladesh, where now the waves coming in are causing the death of hundreds of thousands of people with a storm or any kind of adverse consequence of, say, an earthquake way offshore. The tidal wave now goes far much further inland than it ever did before. It happened in Japan as well. So these things are already happening, but they're happening to the poorest people because the rich folks can move,
Right.
but the poor people can't move. And I would say in the long term, as I mentioned briefly in my talk, I think the men are going to protect themselves. And if they have 2 children, I guarantee you that the boy will be the one who goes to school. If they have a deficiency of food, the girl will get the last chance at food. And if it comes to a choice between which one is protected from environmental change, the girls are going to suffer. So I think that in the long term, although it's indirect, obviously, those kind of adverse consequences are going to take place. But every professor who teaches religion or science or environment or whatever, like I do, you have to learn your facts and then present them to your students and be prepared for some tough questions like I'm getting on the stage today.
So the Carter Center has been congruent with a document that arose from the Rio Earth Summit in '92, and that's the Earth Charter, talking about ecology, justice, and peace. And you've made great strides in these areas. I want to bring to our attention and draw you out on the peace issues, of course, which you've dealt with so much. But again, in this wonderful book, Our Endangered Values, you speak about the nuclear arsenal. And if we take from 45 to 90, 70,000 nuclear warheads developed, something like $8.75 trillion spent on this, the compensation for our own citizens, $1.2 billion, and on and on. So I want to draw you out on this huge and almost unseen military expense going forward and so on. But I want to highlight something that happened 2 years ago at the Y-12 Oak Ridge Center for the Development of Nuclear Weapons. And that was an intervention by Plowshares, which is a Christian pacifist group, a nun, 84 years old, Megan Rice, and 2 other Catholic workers who went there to do a peace movement. She's in jail for 5 years. The other 2 men are in jail for, she's in jail for 3, and they're in jail for 5. On the day after the climate march in New York, the first article in the New York Times was about the refurbishment of nuclear weapons and these nuclear plants to the tune of $1 trillion. So all the things we want to do in these areas of ecology and justice and women and education and so on, the military and nuclear weapons issue looms so strong, and you have been working on this for so many years.
Well, one of the things that I was able to do when I was in the White House was to negotiate with the Soviet Union in what we call a SALT II agreement to reduce dramatically the number of nuclear weapons that were intact. In the title of my most recent book about A Time for Action, I mentioned religion, violence, and power. Women, religion, violence, and power. And I would say that the major issue that we haven't discussed this afternoon concerning women is the orientation of human beings now to the approval or the use of violence. And our country is by far the most culpable. I mentioned how many countries my wife and I have been to. Everywhere we go in America now, in the world now, the number one nation that starts wars is the United States of America. And we have been at war with 30 different nations at least since the Second World War. Only one time, 4 years, I won't say which 4 years, we didn't fire a bullet, we never drop a bomb, we didn't launch a missile. I won't say who was president then, but the fact is that we resort now to war almost as a first alternative instead of a last resort war is emphasized. And American people go along with it because the president gets more popular when he quits being a tough administrator and starts being the commander-in-chief of the military power. So most of the wars we've had since the Second World War were not necessary. Were counterproductive. We know some of the main ones, Vietnam and Iraq and maybe even Korea and so forth. I won't go into detail about that. But in addition to the wars, the United States has gone to the extremes in violence. I'll just give you one example. It's a punitive nature of America toward people who commit a crime. When I left office as governor of Georgia, there was 1 person in 1,000 in America in prison. Nowadays, there's 7.3 people per 1,000. 7 times as many people in prison now as when I left the office as governor. 5 times as many as when I left the White House. There are 800% more black women in prison now than there were when I left the White House. We're the only nation on earth of a developed nation that has a death penalty. We have 3,200 people in prison right now for life that have never committed a crime of violence. So we have become more punitive than we have trying to restore people to a normal life. And I would say that the emphasis on the military expenditures for nuclear weapons, which is now going to be hotly debated in the next Congress, is one of those symbols of America being too much inclined toward going to war instead of monitoring and carrying out the principles that I learned in church. I worship the Prince of Peace, not war.
Yeah. Yeah. That was beautiful. Ramsey Clark testified at the trial for these 3 Catholic workers, and he said, we are in violation of our treaties, but his testimony was not allowed as part of the whole trial. The question is, are we in violation of our treaties? And the invisibility of these nuclear weapons to the American public is absolutely frightening and astonishing to many of us.
Well, I mentioned in my earlier talk, I think, I'm not sure exactly when, that of the 30 paragraphs in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United States is now in violation of 10 of them. And some of them relate to women versus men. And we also declared under President George W. Bush that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to the United States, that we could torture people and it would be compatible with our basic constitutional obligations. I think that's all wrong. So those are the kind of things that are distorted. Sometimes, I don't mean just Republicans, but sometimes by both political parties to the advantage of our country. Since 9/11, we have violated many of the previous international agreements that we formerly even formulated and supported and had always previously observed. Now we've abandoned them. So I think that's kind of a slippery slope that we go down as we turn toward war and turn toward punishing people instead of rehabilitating people. We can turn away from forgiveness and emphasize permanent punishment, those kind of things. It's a matter of religious interpretation, and I'm sure that this group is much more qualified than I to comment on it.
Thank you.
One thing that I find so wonderful about you is your optimism. I think there are reasons, or many could have, for pessimism about the climate, about United States. We learn more and more about our responsibility for violence and war. So what would you tell us about the possibilities for hope in the United States and in our leadership? And you seem to have ever flowing resources of hope and work and optimism. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the basis of that, how that works for you.
Well, I might quote one of my fellow elders, Archbishop Tutu, when he was asked about being overly optimistic. He said, "I'm not optimistic, I'm just a prisoner of hope." And I think this is kind of what I know that from experience that I don't have any proof that we're going to take action against excessive imprisonment. I don't have any proof that the United States is going to turn away from imposing the death penalty. I don't have any proof that we're going to abandon the policy of 3 strikes and you're out, and imprisoning people for life when they haven't admitted any crime of violence. I don't have any proof that we're going to reduce the emphasis of our country on resorting to warfare instead of a peace whenever possible. But I still have hope and expectation that the United States, with its heterogeneous society comprising people from all over the world who come here as adventurers and exploring new ideas, will be as innovative and as constructive in their innovation as any people on earth. So I think as we bring people in here from Vietnam and from Mexico and from Honduras and from Haiti and from other parts of the world, that we are benefiting from the lessons that they have learned there, and when they get to the United States with a new element of freedom,